as to how I changed from an evolutionist to a creationist. It's a very difficult story for me to tell, and I always tell it very reluctantly. So if I stammer here in the beginning a little bit, you must excuse me as I get over it. I don't like digging it all up again. But there are occasions when it is important to show people how God has led in one's life. And so I have to start the story with the very beginning. And maybe then from the background we can see why things happened as they happened. It is a strange story. Some of you might think that parts of it are incomprehensible or may even seem too strange to be true. But it did happen, and it is a fact that it happened like that, and I cannot take it away, so I will tell it as it happened, at least what I remember of it. I was born in a family where my mother was a very staunch, solid Lutheran. She was very faithful in her religion. And my father was a Roman Catholic, and he was very faithful in his religion as well. In those days, it was before the days of Vatican II, and Protestants that were not Catholics were considered to be lost according to Roman Catholic doctrine. But in marriages between Protestants and Catholics, it was essential that the Catholic counterpart in that marriage was to promise that the children would be raised Catholic. And my mother accepted that, and she knew that I would be raised Catholic, and I was raised Catholic. And there was never any argument about religion in our house. My father and my mother respected each other. My father had a couple of problems with the church at one stage because of this marriage, but they overcame them, and then no problem concerning religion ever cropped up in our house. And when I was still quite young, I was about 8 or 7 years old, my mother became ill, and she was diagnosed as having cancer. And they actually gave her a relatively short time to live. They said she would have about 3 to 4 months to live. But she was a very tough lady, and she managed to stretch that to about 4 years. She died when I was 12 years old. But those 4 years were very, very miserable years. She really suffered more than anybody else that I have personally been in contact with. She lost one part of her body after the other. They had to do mastectomies, and then they took out part of her intestines, and she had to have colostomies. And eventually she just lost more and more and more, and she had one operation after the other. In those days, they weren't as sophisticated as they are today. They burnt her under the radium treatment. They forgot her there. They had to peel off black pieces. So she really suffered tremendously. And through all this, she never, ever, ever gave up her faith. And I was very attached to my mother. But because of all the problems in the house, and a mother that was on the verge of death for a long time, over a 4-year period, there was also quite a bit of tension in the house. Now, while at school, I received religious instruction, of course. I was in a Protestant, largely Protestant school. It was the German school. And I received religious instruction separately. The Catholics went to the nun, and she gave religious instructions. Now, I've met some very nice nuns in my life. And I've met nuns that are really gentle and soft people and are very nice to everyone around them. But this particular one, where I received religious instruction, was a very hard person, according to my youthful experience that I had at that time. And she would constantly tell me that it was such a sad thing that my mother, who being Protestant, would not see the kingdom of heaven, but that she would roast in hell forever and ever. And I resented this very much because I was very fond of my mother, particularly since she had such suffering in her life. And this carried on for about 4 years, while my mother was sick. And the more it carried on, the more rebellious I became about the teachings that I was confronted with. I used to attend church very regularly. I had to go to church every Sunday with my father. I went through all the things like communion and all the things that Catholics do. And I became so resentful in the end that I used to be incredibly cheeky in the religious instruction class. And I was then thrown out of the class and told that I was to sit outside in the courtyard. And then for a few years I had living hell in that school because the headmaster was somehow in cahoots with all of this, and whenever he spotted me, he used to thrash me. And I used to take this quite well. I can be quite arrogant, or I used to be very arrogant. Maybe not quite so much anymore, but if you bonks me on the bean, maybe the old man will surface. I don't know. I fight against him all the time. And he used to thrash me, and I remember distinctly I used to bend down, and he used to hit me once, 2, 3 times, and I used to ask him, "Are you finished yet, or is your arm lame? What's the matter with you?" And he used to get so angry that he used to really whack me, and when he got to 6, then I'd say, "1 more please, because then I can take you to court. You're only allowed to hit me 6 times. That's the law." So I wasn't very popular. But the point arose where I was sitting in the class one day, in the religious instruction class again, and this lady, this nun, told me again that people who were like we were, and particularly my mother, would go to hell forever and ever. And I got so angry, I took the catechism book and I tore it and I threw it at her feet, and I told her in not too kind a language, even for that age, what she could do with her God. And I was thrown out from that day on a permanent basis, and I had to sit outside in the courtyard, whether it rained or whether the sun shone. And my life in that school was absolute misery. I never told my parents. Nobody ever knew what was happening. There was another teacher as well who used to call me to the front. Before the class even started, "Would you please come to the front?" And I'd go and stand in the front, and he'd hit me left, right, and threw me out. So I was being thrown out of 2 sessions on a regular basis, and I became an impossible child. I used to sit up in the trees when they come and look for me, the teachers, and I'd have these pine cones, and I used to throw them. Oh boy, those were the days. In any case, my mother finally didn't make it when I was 12 years old, and she died. And then from that time onwards, my home life totally disintegrated. My father married another lady who was a typical stepmother, sort of a fairy tale stepmother. She wouldn't have me around at all, and I was probably impossible, I will admit that. So I was carted off to hostels, and I wasn't allowed to then attend school either anymore. I was supposed to leave school and go into a trade. And that's when I woke up and I decided, no ways, and I don't want to do this. So I managed to persuade some relatives, and I went to another school. And I went through my school life, and I did all right, not too hot, but not too bad either. And then I went to the military, and then finally to the university. But from the age of 12, I never